Close your eyes for a moment, or let them rest, soft and unfocused, on whatever is in front of you. You don't need to be anywhere right now. You don't need to think about tomorrow, or yesterday, or the quiet hum of the world outside. For the next few hours, you are simply here, present, breathing. And together, we are going to travel, not quickly, not urgently. We are going to drift, the way light drifts across an old stone wall in the early morning. Slowly, gently. With nowhere particular to be, we are going to a place that has been waiting for a very long time. A place where mountains touch the clouds, where ancient cities were built so high above the earth that the air itself feels thin and sacred. Where rivers wind through some of the densest jungle on our planet, and the desert meets the ocean in long, pale stretches of silence. We are going to Peru. Say that word slowly if you like. Peru. There is something in it. Something that carries weight, and mystery, and age. This is one of the oldest inhabited places on Earth. Long before the word civilization existed, people were already here, already dealing, already dreaming, already looking up at the same stars you might be looking at right now. The story of Peru is not a simple one. It is layered, the way the Andes themselves are layered, fold upon fold of rock and time, pressed together over millions of years. It is a story of extraordinary human ingenuity, of empires that rose so vast and so organized, but they still astonish historians today, of conquest and survival and quiet resilience. Of ordinary people living their lives, cooking meals, raising children, planting seeds in terraced fields carved into the sides of mountains. And it is a story that is still being written. Tonight, or this evening, or whatever peaceful hour this finds you in, we are going to move through that story together, unhurriedly, letting each chapter settle before we move to the next. There is no rush here. The ancient world has already waited thousands of years. It can wait a little longer while we breathe. We will begin at the very beginning, with the land itself, with the mountains and the rivers and the coastline, with the shape of the place before anyone gave it a name, and from there, we will follow the long, slow thread of human presence, the first footsteps, the first fires, the first walls built against the wind. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath come and go without effort. Peru is waiting for you, and we have all the time in the world. Chapter 1. Location and Geography. Before there were cities, before there were roads or borders or names written on maps, there was the land itself. And the land of Peru is extraordinary. Sit with that for a moment. Before we talk about people, or history, or the long arc of human civilization, just imagine the land, the raw, ancient, breathtaking land. Peru sits on the central western coast of South America, its face turned toward the Pacific Ocean, its body lying entirely in the southern hemisphere. It is held in place by neighbors, Ecuador and Colombia pressing in from the north, Brazil stretching wide to the east, Bolivia sitting quietly to the southeast, and Chile running along the southern edge, like the last page of a chapter. These borders, of course, are human inventions, lines drawn in relatively recent history. But the land they contain has been shaped by forces far older than any human hand. Peru is the third largest country in South America, after Brazil and Argentina, and it covers roughly 1,285,000 square kilometers. That is a vast and varied canvas. Room enough for deserts and glaciers, for jungle canopies and high mountain passes, for river deltas and coastal fog. Room enough for 100 different worlds to exist within the same set of borders. And in many ways, that is exactly what Peru is. The geographers and Peruvians alike tend to speak of the country in three distinct parts, three great regions, each with its own character, its own climate, its own rhythm of life. And as we name them, try to picture each one slowly, like turning the pages of a very old illustrated book. The first is the costa, the coast, a narrow strip of land running the full length of the country along the Pacific. It sounds beautiful, and in places it is, but much of it is desert. Pale, quiet, windswept desert, interrupted here and there by fertile river valleys that come tumbling down from the mountains above, carrying water and life to the dry earth below. These valleys have been farmed for thousands of years. They are oases in the most literal sense, green ribbons cutting through pale sand, heading toward the sea. The second region is the Sierra, the highlands, the Andes Mountains. This is perhaps the image most people carry when they think of Peru. And rightly so. The Andes run the full length of the country from north to south like a great spine, ancient, imposing, and staggeringly beautiful. Among these peaks rises Mount Huascarán, Peru's highest point, standing at 6,768 meters above sea level. Close your eyes and try to imagine that height. The air up there is thin and cold and sharp. The sky above is a deep, almost impossible blue. The world below looks small and very far away. And then there is the third region, the selva, the jungle. This is perhaps the most surprising thing about Peru to those who have never studied it closely. Around 60% of Peru's total territory lies within the Amazon basin. More than half of this country, by area, is covered in tropical rainforest. Dense, ancient, teeming, extraordinary rainforest. One of the largest areas of Amazonian jungle on the entire planet sits quietly within Peru's borders, largely unseen, largely untouched, full of life beyond counting. Peru, then, is not one place, it is many places, folded together. Its position on the map, lying between the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn, might suggest a uniformly warm and tropical climate. But the reality is far more complex and far more interesting. The cold Humboldt Current sweeps up along the Pacific coast, cooling the air and keeping much of the coastline arid. The Andes block and redirect moisture in ways that create dozens of different microclimates on their slopes. The jungle catches rain that never reaches the mountains. The result is a country of remarkable environmental variety, a place where you could, in theory, move from desert to cloud forest to tropical lowland, all within the same day's journey. And most Peruvians, most of the people who call this extraordinary land home, live not in the mountains and not in the jungle, but on that narrow coastal strip, clustered along the Pacific. And at the heart of that coastal life sits Lima, the capital city, the largest city, the place where modern Peru beats loudest and fastest. But Lima and modernity and all that comes with it, that is a story for much later. For now, just hold the shape of it, the long spine of the Andes, the pale desert coast, the vast green silence of the Amazon, the cold Pacific watching it all from the west. This is the stage, ancient, patient, and vast. And the story is just beginning. Chapter 2. Early Human Presence. Imagine, for a moment, the world as it was 15,000 years ago. The coastlines of the world look different. The air is different. The animals are different. And somewhere along the western edge of South America, on a stretch of coast where the cold Pacific meets the pale Peruvian shore, there are people. They have always, in some sense, been there. Or rather, they found their way there, long ago, following routes and coastlines and instincts we can only begin to guess at. And they stayed. Because this place, this particular edge of the world, had something to offer. The sea. Some of the earliest well-dated evidence of human life on Peru's Pacific coast reaches back at least 15,000 years, deep into the late Ice Age, to a site we now call Huaca Prieta. It is one of those names that carries enormous weight quietly, without fanfare. Huaca Prieta, a mound on the coast, and within it, layer upon layer of human story, pressed into the earth like the pages of a book that no one knew how to read until very recently. What those layers tell us is something beautiful and a little surprising. These early coastal people were not primarily hunters of great land animals, the way we sometimes imagine early humans to have been. They were people of the sea. They fished. They gathered shellfish from the rocks. They hunted sea mammals along the shore. They had developed, remarkably early, a deep and sophisticated relationship with the ocean and everything it offered. But they were not only people of the sea. At Huaca Prieta and at nearby coastal sites, the evidence shows something else quietly taking root. Gardens. Or the earliest, most tentative beginnings of gardens. Avocados, beans, chili peppers. These early inhabitants were not simply foraging and moving on. They were beginning, in small and careful ways, to manage the plants around them, to encourage certain things to grow, to return to the same places, season after season, and tend to what they had begun. It is a humble, quiet kind of revolution. No dramatic moment, no single invention, just people, paying attention to the land, learning its rhythms, and slowly, over generations, beginning to shape it. While this was unfolding along the coast, something equally remarkable was happening high above. In the central Peruvian Andes, tucked into the mountains at an altitude that would leave most of us breathless, lies Laricocha Cave, and within it, some of the earliest direct evidence of human presence at high altitude in all of South America, human remains dating back around 8,000 years, to a time we call the early to middle Holocene. 8,000 years ago. Calls on that number for a moment. Let it settle. The cave at Laricocha was already ancient by the time the Egyptian pyramids were built, and yet people were there, living there, returning there, again and again, across millennia. The sequence of occupation at Laricocha stretches from those earliest pre-ceramic times through much later periods, a long, unbroken thread of human presence in a cold, thin-aired, extraordinary place. Laricocha was not alone. Across the high Andes of Peru, other caves and rock shelters tell similar stories. Guitarrero Cave, Pachamachi, Telamachi, each one a shelter, a home, a waypoint in the lives of people learning to live at altitude, adapting their bodies and their habits and their knowledge to an environment that demanded everything they had. These were hunter-gatherers, moving through high, cold landscapes, tracking animals across plateaus where the wind cuts sharp and the sky presses close, and the world feels simultaneously vast and intimate. It is a hard life to imagine from where we sit now, and yet they thrived, generation after generation after generation. And then, slowly, the way all the most important things happen, something began to change. By around 5,000 years ago, in the coastal river valleys north of modern Lima, a civilization was emerging that would rewrite our understanding of the ancient Americas entirely. We call it Caral, or sometimes the Caral Super Civilization. And what it represents is extraordinary. One of the earliest urban societies in the entire Western Hemisphere, a place of monumental pyramids, of planned settlements, of organized communal life, on a scale that no one expected to find so early in this part of the world. Caral challenges assumptions. It asks us to sit with the fact that complexity, real, sophisticated, architectural complexity, was flowering here in South America at the same time as the great early civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, quietly, independently, in the river valleys of coastal Peru, while much of the world was still learning what a city could be. And recent discoveries have added yet another layer. Near Caral, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a city called Penico, roughly 3,500 years old, which appears to have functioned as a trading center, a meeting place, a hub connecting the coast, the Andes, and the Amazon. Three different worlds, already in conversation with one another, already exchanging goods and ideas and perhaps stories across the vast and varied geography we explored in our last chapter. Further north, in the highland region of Pacapampa, the story grows richer still, a complex of settlements with occupation stretching back to around 1200 BCE, and within it, a burial, 3,000 years old, an individual interred with care and ceremony, interpreted by archaeologists as one of the earliest known priests in all of the Andes. Someone set apart, someone who held a role beyond the everyday. Someone, perhaps, who stood between the people and whatever sacred forces they believed moved through the world. Taken together, the coastal foragers of Huaca Prieta, the highland cave dwellers of Laricocha, the city builders of Caral, the traders of Penico, the priest of Paco Pampa, what we see is not a simple story of isolated people stumbling slowly towards civilization. What we see is a spreading, diversifying, deeply connected web of human life. People moving from productive coastal zones up into highland valleys. People adapting to wildly different environments with creativity and resilience. People already, in these earliest chapters, weaving the different regions of Peru together. The land was vast and varied, and the people were already learning all of it, already building, already dreaming, already here. Chapter 3: Early Societies and Daily Life. There is something quietly profound about trying to imagine an ordinary day in the ancient world. Not the grand moments, not the ceremonies or the construction of monuments or the movements of armies. Just an ordinary day, the morning light coming in, the smell of food, the sound of water nearby, the weight of a tool in someone's hand. Let's try. Somewhere along the Peruvian coast, perhaps around 3,000 years before the Common Era, 5,000 years ago, give or take, the sun is rising over a small settlement near the mouth of a river valley. The houses here are modest, semi-subterranean, dug partly into the earth, which keeps them cooler in the heat and warmer when the night turns cold. They are not grand, but they are deliberate. They are home. This is a place like Huaca Prieta, or one of the many similar settlements that dotted the Peruvian coast in the late pre-ceramic period, roughly between 3,500 and 1,800 years before the Common Era. And the people who live here have arranged their lives with a kind of elegant practicality. They sit close to the river, close to the sea, both worlds within reach, the fields just behind them, the ocean just ahead. In the morning, some will go to the water, fishing lines and nets, the cold Pacific, the familiar rhythm of casting and waiting and pulling. Others will wade among the rocks, gathering shellfish, patient, methodical work that yields a reliable and nourishing reward. And others still will turn toward the fields, where squash and chilies and cotton grow in carefully tended rows. It is worth pausing on that detail. These people were not yet making pottery. They were not yet growing maize in significant quantities. But they were growing cotton, and they were doing extraordinary things with it. Textile production in these early coastal societies was already sophisticated, far beyond what we might expect. Elaborate baskets woven with skill and intention. Early cotton textiles dyed with some of the oldest known colorants in the Americas. Color, craft, and beauty, already present in the world, already important, thousands of years before anyone thought to fire clay into a pot. And the land itself was already being managed with remarkable intelligence. In the Zaina Valley and other coastal lowlands, archaeologists have found the traces of small stone-lined irrigation canals, channels cut and laid with care to carry water from the rivers out into the fields. This is not accidental. This is engineering. This is organized labor and accumulated knowledge, communities working together, generation after generation, to understand how water moves through the earth and how to guide it where it is needed. Hydraulic management, in its quiet and essential beginnings, already present here on the Peruvian coast thousands of years ago. Now, let us move a little further north and a little further back in time, to one of the most remarkable places in the ancient Americas, Caral. We touched on Caral in our last chapter, the great early urban civilization of the Peruvian coast. But now let us sit with it a little longer. Let us try to imagine what daily life there actually felt like. The Caral settlements were organized around monumental platform mounds, enormous earthen pyramids rising above the desert floor, and sunken circular plazas where the community gathered. These were not purely ceremonial spaces, distant from everyday life. They were the center of it, the heartbeat around which everything else was arranged. The economy was mixed and carefully balanced. Inland fields, irrigated by river water, produced cotton, beans, and sweet potatoes. And down on the coast, just a short distance away, fishing communities hauled in anchovies and other fish by the net load, nets made, of course, from Carol's cotton. Inland agriculture and coastal fishing in quiet, essential partnership. Each community depending on the other, goods moving back and forth through the river valleys like blood through veins. The social structure at Caral was beginning to stratify. Elites were emerging, individuals and families who coordinated trade, managed the redistribution of food and goods, and directed the enormous communal labor needed to raise those great platform mounds. We might think of it as a chiefdom, not yet the highly formalized state structures that would come later, but already something more organized and hierarchical than a simple village, already a society with roles and responsibilities, with people who planned and people who built and people who kept account of things. And woven through all of it, through the farming and the fishing and the construction and the trade, was ritual, ceremony, the sacred. Across early Peruvian societies, religion was not separate from daily life. It was daily life. In many ways, the great temple complexes were not remote and abstract institutions. They shaped the community calendar. They determined when to plant and when to harvest. They called people together for communal labor. They created and reinforced social identity, the sense of belonging to something larger than one family, one household, one generation. This becomes even clear when we look at Chavin de Honta, a later site, from the formative period deep in the northern highlands of the Andes. Chavin was, at its heart, a great ceremonial center, a place of religious authority and ritual power. But surrounding its temple core were domestic sectors, neighborhoods essentially, where craftspeople lived and worked. Artisans producing ritual objects and ceramics that fed the ceremonial life of the complex. Household economies directly and intimately connected to religious authority. The sacred and the everyday, completely inseparable. At Chavin and in the highland communities around it, life rested on a different set of crops than on the coast. Potatoes, maize, quinoa, that remarkable grain that thrives at altitude, hardy and nourishing, perfectly suited to the cold, thin air of the Andes. And, alongside the crops, animals. Llamas and alpacas, domesticated and deeply woven into highland life, providing meat, providing wool for textiles, providing transport across mountain terrain that would otherwise be nearly impossible to navigate. These animals were not merely useful, they were essential, partners in a sense, in the project of living at altitude. So here, in these early chapters of Peruvian civilization, a picture is taking shape. Not a single picture, many pictures, layered and overlapping. Coastal fisherfolk in their pit houses, weaving cotton in the evening light. Irrigation engineers laying stone channels in the desert valleys. The great mounds of Caral rising against the pale sky. A craftsperson in the shadows of Chavin, shaping clay into something sacred. A herder on a cold Andean plateau, moving alpacas through the thin morning air. Different worlds, different altitudes, different rhythms. And yet connected by trade, by religion, by the slow accumulation of shared knowledge passing down through the generations, like a quietly burning flame. The ordinary days of ancient Peru, humble, intricate, and quietly astonishing. Chapter 4. First Organized States. There is a moment in the life of any human community, impossible to pinpoint exactly, impossible to mark on a calendar, when something shifts, when a collection of families becomes a village, when a village becomes a town, when a town begins to organize itself in ways that reach beyond the immediate and the personal, when someone begins to plan and others begin to follow, and the whole begins to move together with a kind of coordinated intention that no single person could have produced alone. That moment in Peru came very early. We have already spent time with Caral, with its great mounds and its cotton fields and its fishing communities down on the coast. But now, let us look at it more carefully. Let us look at what it actually was, in political terms. Because what was taking shape in those river valleys of the north-central Peruvian coast, between roughly 3,500 and 1,800 years before the Common Era, was something historians and archaeologists now recognize as one of the earliest organized polities in all of the Americas. The Carol Supe civilization, sometimes called the Norte Chico, was not a single city, it was a network. Around 30 major population centers, spread across several river valleys, the Supe, the Pativilca, the Fortaleza, each one connected to the others by shared architectural traditions and exchange relationships. Goods moving between valleys, ideas moving between communities. A web of settlements that, taken together, constituted something larger than the sum of its parts. And the signs of genuine state organization are unmistakable. Planned urban layouts, not settlements that simply grew organically, but places that were designed. Monumental platform mounds requiring coordinated labor on a scale that only organized authority can produce. Sunken plazas for communal gathering. Irrigation systems linking fields across the valley floors. This is not spontaneous. This is governance. This is planning across time and space, sustained across generations. What kind of authority held it together? Here is where Carol Supe offers something particularly interesting. The evidence does not point to a militarized ruling class, to warriors and weapons in conquest. There are no fortifications here, no obvious signs of organized violence. Instead, the power at Caro appears to have been religious. Ritual. A priestly elite who organized large public ceremonies, who oversaw the great construction projects. He stood at the center of communal life not through force, but through sacred authority, through the management of meaning. It is a quieter kind of power than we often imagine when we think of ancient states, and perhaps, in its own way, a more durable one. Carol Supe eventually faded, the way all civilizations eventually fade, and the centuries that followed saw Peru's landscape shift and reorganize. New centers emerged, new forms of authority, new ways of binding people together across the difficult varied terrain of coast and mountain and jungle. And then, somewhere around 900 years before the Common Era, something new began to spread across the Andes. Not a state exactly, not an empire, something stranger and in some ways more powerful, an idea. A shared religious vision, a cult. We call it the Chavin culture, and its center was a place called Chavin de Huanta, tucked into the highlands of northern Peru, at the confluence of two rivers, deep in the mountains. The temple complex there was extraordinary, a labyrinth of stone galleries and hidden passages, dramatic architecture designed to overwhelm and inspire, decorated with carvings of supernatural beings that blended human and animal forms, in ways that were clearly meant to unsettle and awe. The priests of Chavin de Huanta were masters of ceremony and spectacle. They used their temples, their art, and their rituals to project influence far beyond their own valley, reaching out across the Andes, drawing distant communities into a shared religious world. Chavin is sometimes described as the first pan-Indian horizon, the first time a single cultural and ideological system extended its reach across the many different peoples and environments of this vast mountain range. It is worth pausing on what that means. In a landscape as fragmented as the Andes, where each valley can feel like its own world, where altitude and terrain create barriers that make communication genuinely difficult, the ability to create a shared symbolic language, a shared sacred iconography, recognized and revered across hundreds of kilometers, is a remarkable political and cultural achievement. Chavin did not conquer, it persuaded, it inspired. It offered meaning on a continental scale. After Chavin, the pattern becomes richer and more varied still. On Peru's southern coast, the Nazca people built a civilization remembered today for its extraordinary artistry and for those great geometric lines etched into the desert floor that still puzzle and fascinate us. On the northern coast, the Moche rose to prominence, a sophisticated state with its own rulers, its own iconography, its own state-organized irrigation agriculture, feeding dense populations along the coastal river valleys. both flourishing in the centuries around the turn of the Common Era, both developing their own distinct forms of political and social organization. And then, in the highlands, something even more explicitly imperial began to take shape. The Wari, sometimes written Huari, emerged in the central Andes around 600 CE and built what we might genuinely call an empire. Road systems connecting distant regions, provincial centers established in conquered territories, administrative storage facilities, great warehouses where goods collected as tribute could be stockpiled and redistributed. These are the unmistakable hallmarks of bureaucratic state organization, of a government that thinks not just about this valley, this season, this harvest, but about a network of places, a system of control, a project that extends across space and time. To the south, around the great high-altitude lake of Titicaca, the Tiwanaku civilization developed along parallel lines, another highland power with imperial reach, another network of roads and centers and administrative infrastructure. Wari and Tiwanaku were not the Inca, but they were, in a very real sense, the Inca's teachers. The institutional knowledge they developed, the road networks, the provincial administration, the state religion, the organized redistribution of goods, all of this would be absorbed, refined, and vastly expanded by the empire that came after. Every great civilization stands on the shoulders of those that preceded it. The Inca Empire, the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from 5,000 years of accumulated Peruvian statecraft. From the religious authority of Carol's priests, from the shared iconography of Chavin, from the coastal sophistication of the Moche and Nazca, from the imperial infrastructure of Wari and Tiwanaku, layer upon layer upon layer, each generation inheriting something from the last, each state adding something new to the long, slow project of human organization in this extraordinary corner of the world. The groundwork laid across millennia, and something remarkable, building quietly toward the light. Chapter 5. Gradual changes over time. History rarely announces itself. The great shifts, the ones that reshape civilizations, that alter the course of thousands of lives, almost never arrive as single dramatic moments. They arrive the way seasons arrive, gradually, imperceptibly at first. A little more rain one year, a little less frost. A new tool passed between neighbors, a new idea carried along a trade route. And then one day, looking back, everything is different, and no one can say exactly when the turning happened. Peru's long story is full of these quiet turnings. We have already stood at the beginning, at Carol, at those first great mounds rising from the desert valley floors. Let us now take a longer view. Let us move slowly through the centuries, the way a river moves through a landscape, carving, shaping, depositing, changing course when it must. By around 3,000 years before the Common Era, the Carol Soup civilization had already established something genuinely remarkable. One of the first urban societies in the entire Americas, monumental architecture, coordinated labor, a mixed economy of irrigated fields and coastal fishing. And yet, for all its sophistication, this was a world without pottery, without metal. The tools were stone and bone and fiber. The containers were baskets and gourds. The achievements were real and extraordinary, and they were accomplished with almost none of the materials we instinctively associate with advanced civilization. It is a useful reminder that human ingenuity does not wait for its tools. It works with what is present. Then came what archaeologists call the initial period, roughly 1800 to 900 years before the Common Era. A long, quiet expansion, more regions adopting irrigation agriculture, permanent villages multiplying across coastal and highland valleys alike, ceremonial centers appearing in new places, communities investing collective labor in sacred architecture, in the physical expression of shared belief. The world of ancient Peru was filling in, becoming denser, more connected, more complex. And then, the Chavin horizon. That remarkable moment, already touched upon, when a single religious vision spread itself across the Andes like morning light across a mountain range. From around 900 to 200 years before the Common Era, the art and ritual language of Xavin de Huanta reached into communities far beyond the highland valleys of its origin. A shared symbolic world, knitting previously separate peoples into something broader. Not an empire, no armies, no conquest, but a cultural integration, quiet and profound. After Xavin, the world fractured again into regions, and this, too, was its own kind of richness. Between roughly 200 years before the Common Era and 600 years into it, a span historians call the Early Intermediate Period, the coasts and highlands of Peru bloomed with distinct and vibrant cultures, each one its own world, each one adding something irreplaceable to the long human story of this place. On the southern coast, the Nazca, their pottery among the most beautiful produced anywhere in the ancient Americas, polychrome, intricate, alive with imagery. Their great irrigation systems feeding fields in one of the driest places on Earth. And those lines, those vast mysterious geoglyphs etched into the desert plateau, animals and geometric forms visible only from the air, laid down with a precision that still astonishes. No one knows with certainty why they were made. Perhaps they were sacred, perhaps astronomical, perhaps simply the expression of a people who needed, in some deep way, to leave their mark upon the earth in the grandest possible terms. On the northern coast, the Moshe, sophisticated, hierarchical, militaristic. Their temples, the Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna, enormous adobe pyramids rising from the coastal plain. Their pottery startlingly realistic, depicting human faces with an intimacy and individuality that feels almost modern. Their society increasingly stratified, warrior elites, priests, specialist craftspeople, each occupying distinct and unequal positions. The burials of this period tell a particularly vivid story. The grave goods of the wealthy are extraordinary: golden ornaments, fine textiles, elaborate ceramics. The graves of the poor are simple. Inequality, already ancient. Social hierarchy was deepening everywhere in this period. The relatively flat communities of earlier times were giving way to something more tiered, more formalized. Power was becoming more visible, more hereditary, more entrenched. And then, from the highlands, a new wave of integration. The Middle Horizon, roughly 600 to 1,000 years of the Common Era, brought the Wari and Tiwanaku states to prominence. We have met them already, but let us linger here a moment on what their rise represented in the long sweep of things. This was not simply one more regional culture asserting itself. This was something qualitatively different, a more explicitly imperial form of organization. Roads, provincial centers, storage facilities, administrative systems for moving goods and people and information across vast distances. The Wari, in particular, pushed deep into territories far from their highland heartland, establishing outposts and provincial capitals in a deliberate and systematic way. They were not simply trading partners with distant communities. They were governing them, managing them, incorporating them into a wider political project. This was new, and it was important. When Wari and Tiwanaku eventually declined, as all things eventually do, the landscape they left behind was not the same one they had found. The idea of large-scale political integration had been planted. The infrastructure, roads, terraces, storage systems, remained, waiting to be used again. The late intermediate period that followed, from around 1000 to 1476 CE, was an era of fragmentation and competition. Many kingdoms, many city-states. The Chimu on the northern coast, building the great adobe city of Chan Chan, a sprawling labyrinthine metropolis, the largest pre-Columbian city in South America, and extending their trade networks up and down the Pacific corridor in metals and textiles and luxury goods. The Chachapoya in the cloud forests of the northern highlands, building their clifftop settlements and developing a fierce reputation for independence. The Chanka, the Wonka, and others in the highlands, militarized, competitive, constantly negotiating the shifting boundaries of power. It was a crowded, complicated, dynamic world. And from within it, from one particular highland valley, from one particular group centered on a city called Cusco, something was stirring. The Inca began as one regional power among many, not obviously destined for greatness. Not yet the masters of a continent, but they were observant, they were adaptive, and they were, in ways that would only become clear later, extraordinarily good at taking what already existed: the roads, the terraces, the administrative systems, the religious frameworks, and scaling it, systematizing it. Turning the accumulated wisdom of 5,000 years of Peruvian statecraft into something that had never quite existed before. The empire was coming, but it did not come from nothing. It came from all of this. From every canal dug in the Zanya Valley, every mound raised at Caral, every road laid by Wari engineers, every harvest stored in a highland granary, every generation that built upon the last, adding quietly to the great, slow, accumulating project of human civilization in the Andes. Change, arriving the way it always does, gradually, and then all at once.
Chapter 6: Outside Influence and Foreign Rule. There are moments in history that divide time. Before and after the 15th of November, 1532, is one of those moments for Peru. On that day, in the northern highland city of Cajamarca, the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro met the Inca ruler Atahualpa. The meeting had been arranged under the guise of peaceful dialogue. What followed was neither peaceful nor a dialogue. Pizarro's small force, a few hundred soldiers, armed with steel and firearms and horses, none of which the Inca had ever encountered, launched a sudden, violent ambush. Thousands of Inca attendants were killed in the chaos. Atahualpa himself was captured, the greatest ruler in the Western Hemisphere, the living embodiment of divine solar authority, taken prisoner in the space of an afternoon. The world that had taken 5,000 years to build had just met the force that would unmake it. Let us sit with that for a moment, not rushing past it, not tidying it into the clean language of historical inevitability. Something irreplaceable was lost in what followed, something that can never be fully recovered or fully known. Atahualpa's capture did not end Inca resistance immediately. The story was longer and more complicated than a single afternoon. For 40 years after Cajamarca, remnant Inca forces held out in the remote highland region of Vilcabamba, a last pocket of indigenous sovereignty, maintaining the forms and traditions of the empire, even as the colonial world closed in around it. But in 1572, the last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured by Spanish forces and brought to Cusco. He was executed in the main plaza of the city his ancestors had built. The independent Inca state was over. The Spanish moved quickly to organize what they had taken. By the mid-16th century, the conquered territories had been formalized as the Viceroyalty of Peru, one of the great administrative units of the Spanish colonial empire, eventually encompassing most of Spanish South America. Its capital was Lima, the city Pizarro himself had founded on the Pacific coast in 1535. Lima became the seat of a powerful colonial administration, a place of Spanish churches and colonial plazas built, in many cases, directly on top of indigenous foundations. The stones of the old world repurposed for the new. From Lima, the machinery of colonial extraction was set in motion. The systems the Spanish devised for organizing indigenous labor were efficient and brutal. The encomienda granted Spanish colonists the labor and tribute of indigenous communities within a defined area, in theory, in exchange for protection and Christian instruction. In practice, it was exploitation dressed in legal language. Later, the repartimiento of formalized forced labor obligations across a wider population, directing indigenous workers into agriculture, into construction, into the service of colonial elites, and above all, into the mines. The Silver Mountain of Potosí, in what is now Bolivia, was one of the wonders and horrors of the colonial world. From its depths came a torrent of silver that funded the Spanish Empire and flowed into the global economy, into the markets of Europe and China, and the trading ports of the entire world. And the labor that extracted that silver came in enormous quantities from the Andean people of Peru. Compelled by the mitre system, a colonial adaptation of an older Inca labor obligation, indigenous men were forced to travel vast distances to work in the mines of Potosí and in the mercury mines of Huancavelica, closer to home. The mercury was needed to process the silver. Both mines were deadly. The conditions underground were dark and poisonous and unrelenting. Generations of Andean men went into those mountains. Many did not come back. Alongside the economic transformation came the cultural one. Catholic missionaries, Dominicans, Jesuits, Franciscans, moved through the Andean world with an evangelical urgency, establishing missions, building churches, converting indigenous populations to Christianity. In many ways, they were sincere. In many ways, they genuinely believed they were offering something of value. But the campaign of conversion was also, inevitably, a campaign of suppression. Traditional religious practices, the veneration of sacred mountains, the care of ancestor mummies, the great agricultural ceremonies, were labeled idolatry and systematically attacked. Priests conducted extirpation campaigns, destroying sacred objects, punishing practitioners, attempting to erase the spiritual world the Andes had built across millennia. They did not entirely succeed. Andean spirituality proved remarkably resilient, bending, adapting, absorbing Christian forms while preserving indigenous meanings beneath them. But the damage was real. The losses were real. And then there was the catastrophe that no policy caused and no policy could stop: disease. The indigenous populations of the Americas had no prior exposure to the illnesses the Europeans carried with them. Smallpox, measles, and small orbits. When the subject is temporary, it cannot persecute. The demographic collapse that followed contact was one of the greatest human catastrophes in recorded history. Estimates vary, but scholars believe that the indigenous population of Peru fell by somewhere between 50 and 90% in the first century of Spanish rule. Communities that had existed for thousands of years simply ceased to exist. Villages emptied, fields went unplanted. The accumulated social fabric of generations, the knowledge, the relationships, the traditions, unraveled faster than anything human cruelty alone could have managed. The Andes had survived conquest. They could not fully survive the invisible armies the conquistadors had unknowingly brought with them. Centuries passed. The colonial world settled into its routines of extraction and administration. And then, in the 18th century, the Spanish crown began to tighten its grip further still. The Bourbon reforms, a sweeping series of administrative changes imposed from Madrid, increased taxes, restructured colonial boundaries, and pushed out Creole elites who had grown accustomed to a degree of local autonomy. The reforms bit hardest on the indigenous population, already bearing the heaviest burdens of the colonial system. The response, in 1780, was one of the largest indigenous uprisings in the history of the Americas. José Gabriel Condorcanqui, who took the name Tupac Amaru II, deliberately invoking the memory of the last executed Inca ruler, led a massive rebellion across the southern Andes. At its height, his forces threatened the colonial order across a vast swathe of Peru and Bolivia. The Spanish suppressed it with overwhelming force. Tupac Amaru II and his execution in the plaza of Cusco was deliberately designed to be as terrible as possible, a message written in violence intended to prevent any future uprising from even being imagined. It did not prevent what came next. In 1808, Napoleon's armies invaded Spain and placed his brother on the Spanish throne. The legitimacy of colonial authority, always ultimately dependent on the authority of the Spanish crown, suddenly became uncertain. Across Spanish America, Creole elites who had long chafed under colonial restrictions began to ask new questions, to imagine new possibilities. Peru was slower to move toward independence than some of its neighbors. The Creole elite here was more conservative, more entangled with the colonial system, more fearful of what independence might unleash. In the end, Peruvian independence was secured not primarily from within, but from without. José de San Martín, coming up from the south with an army forged in Argentina and Chile. Simón Bolívar, coming down from the north with the momentum of Venezuelan and Colombian liberation behind him. Foreign armies fighting on Peruvian soil for a Peruvian independence that many Peruvians themselves had not yet fully claimed. San Martín proclaimed Peruvian independence in Lima in 1821. The last Spanish forces were defeated in the battles of Junín and Ayacucho in 1824. Formal Spanish rule, after nearly 3 centuries, was over. But the world the Spanish had built, the social hierarchies, the economic structures, the racial categories, the church, the cities, the language, none of that dissolved with the colonial administration. It remained. It had become, over 300 years, simply the world. And into that world, layered, fractured, scarred, and still extraordinarily alive, the people of Peru now stepped, claiming a future that was finally, formally, their own, whatever that would mean, whatever it would cost. Chapter 7. Ordinary life under these changes. History, when told from a distance, tends to follow the powerful. The conquistadors, the viceroys, the rebels and the rulers, the great names carved into monuments and written into official records. But most people, in any era, in any civilization, were not powerful. They were ordinary, and their lives, unfolding quietly beneath the noise of politics and war, contain a truth about the human experience that the grand narratives rarely capture. So let us descend now, away from the palaces and the administrative chambers, away from the battlefields and the proclamations. Let us walk into a village, into a market, into a kitchen, into an ordinary life in colonial Peru. Imagine the village, not the one that existed before. That village is gone now. In the decades following the conquest, Spanish colonial authorities systematically reorganized indigenous communities into what they called reducciones, resettlement towns, planned, grid-shaped, Spanish in their geometry. Indigenous people were compelled to leave their ancestral villages, the places where their grandparents had been born, where the sacred mountains were familiar, where the land itself held memory. and move into these new, orderly settlements, where they could be counted, taxed, converted, and supervised. It was a profound uprooting, not a single dramatic event, but a slow, administrative dismantling of the relationship between people and the places that had defined them for generations. And yet, people adapted. They brought what they could. They rebuilt, in new places, the social and spiritual structures that mattered most. The human need to belong, to connect, to continue, proved more durable than the colonial planners likely anticipated. Within these new villages, and on the haciendas that spread across the countryside, the rhythm of daily life was shaped above all by obligation. For indigenous men, the year moved between two gravitational pulls. The first was the communal plot, their own land, or what remained of it, where they grew the food their families needed to survive. The second was the meter, the labor draft that could pull them away for months at a time, sending them to the mines of Potosí or Huancavelica, to textile workshops called obrajes, or to public construction projects serving the colonial administration. These absences restructured family life in ways that were difficult and often devastating. Fathers gone for seasons at a stretch. Sons sent away before they had fully learned what their fathers knew. The continuity of knowledge and relationship interrupted, again and again, by the demands of the colonial economy. On the haciendas, the calculus was different, but no less demanding. Peasant families living on privately owned estates paid rent in the form of labor, days of work given to the landlord before any time could be spent on their own subsistence. Much of the year was structured around meeting someone else's needs first. The family's own fields, their own harvests, their own futures, these came second, always second. And yet, within these constraints, life continued. Meals were cooked, children were raised, festivals were observed. Love, grief, humor, and community persisted in the spaces the colonial system left unclaimed. For indigenous women, the daily world was a layered negotiation between old and new. The ancient tasks remained. Weaving, that deep, skilled, essential art that had been central to Andean life for thousands of years, continued in colonial households, now sometimes redirected toward producing cloth for Spanish markets. Chicha brewing, the fermentation of maize beer that had ritual and social importance stretching back centuries. Trading in markets, where women had long been central economic actors, sharp and knowledgeable and present. But new obligations had been added alongside the old. European foods to prepare for Spanish households, laundry to wash, basic Catholic prayer and devotions to learn and demonstrate. A woman's day in colonial Peru was longer and more complicated than her grandmother's had been, pulled in multiple directions by multiple systems of demand, navigating between worlds that did not always acknowledge one another. And yet, in the household, in the kitchen, in the quiet spaces away from official scrutiny, the old world survived. Mountain spirits received their offerings. The earth deity, Pachamama, was still honored with small libations poured into the ground before planting. Sacred places, a particular rock, a particular spring, a particular high place on the hillside, continued to receive the attention they had always received. Outwardly, the village attended mass. The children were baptized. The children were baptized. They feared what they had to do and what they did. The saints' days were observed, but beneath the Christian surface, Andean spiritual life continued, not unchanged, not entirely intact, but alive, persisted, quietly, stubbornly present. Religion in colonial Peru was not a replacement, it was a layering. a blend that neither side perhaps fully understood or fully intended, but that ordinary people fashioned from the materials available to them. Now, step away from the village. Come to the market. On market days, in the plazas of colonial towns and cities across Peru, something remarkable happened. The rigid racial and social hierarchies of colonial society, so carefully maintained in law and in church and in the official spaces of power, became considerably more fluid in practice. Indigenous people arrived from their villages, speaking Quechua or Aymara. Enslaved Africans and free people of African descent came from the cities and the haciendas. Mixed race people of every combination occupied the middle spaces. And Spanish colonists moved through it all, buying and selling and listening and talking. Multiple languages in the air at once, multiple histories brushing against each side and sending the message to the Spanish figures to commerce. They saw the characters cozy, his faces in bells, backing loudly, and strangled for the facts of commerce. Bargaining, news sharing, the negotiation of small daily transactions that were also, in some quiet way, the negotiation of a new and complicated society, trying to understand what it was. Lima, the colonial capital, had a particularly complex social world. Enslaved Africans and their descendants formed a major and visible part of the city's workforce. Domestic servants, artisans, street vendors, dock laborers, and they were not simply passive subjects of colonial control. Within the constraints of an extraordinarily brutal system, Afro-Peruvian communities created their own cultural life. Confraternities, mutual aid societies organized around Catholic saints provided community, resources, and a degree of collective voice. Festivals carried rhythms and traditions across the ocean from West Africa, transforming in the New World into something that was neither purely African nor purely Peruvian, but distinctly, irreducibly both. Even clothing carried a kind of political weight in this world. Colonial authorities tried to use dress as a system of visible social control. Sumptuary laws dictating who could wear silk, who could wear certain hats, who could display certain jewelry. Indigenous people were pushed towards Spanish garments, while also retaining distinctive Andean styles. What someone wore in colonial Peru announced, or was intended to announce, who they were, where they belonged, what their place in the hierarchy was, and ordinary people, quietly and persistently, played with those signals. Wearing what they could access, asserting what they could of their own identity within the rules that constrained them. Children growing up in this world were extraordinarily adaptable. In mixed communities, many grew up speaking 2 or 3 languages, Quechua at home, Spanish in dealings with authorities and markets, perhaps Aymara with certain neighbors. This linguistic agility was not merely a cognitive achievement, it was a survival skill. The ability to move between languages was the ability to move between worlds, to present oneself differently in different contexts, to access different systems of protection and opportunity, to navigate courts and churches and markets with a degree of sophistication that the colonial system, in its rigidity, never fully anticipated or appreciated. Because ordinary people, it turns out, were remarkably skilled at using the colonial system's own tools against it. They went to court, they filed petitions, they dictated legal complaints and sent them to distant officials. Village leaders and ordinary commoners alike learned to navigate the Spanish legal system. Slowly, expansively, often frustratingly, but persistently. They appealed to church networks. They traveled to colonial towns to seek audiences with administrators. They built relationships with sympathetic priests or local officials who might intercede on their behalf. This was not dramatic resistance. It was not rebellion. It was something quieter and in many ways more remarkable. The daily, grinding, determined work of ordinary people, refusing to be entirely consumed by a system designed to consume them. Using the language of colonial law to protect communal lands. Using the structures of the Catholic Church to maintain community cohesion. Using literacy, where they could access it, as a tool of survival. The colonial centuries were not simply a story of domination. They were also a story of endurance, of the extraordinary, stubborn, creative persistence of ordinary human beings, weaving, brewing, trading, praying in two languages, filing legal complaints, raising bilingual children, pouring small offerings into the earth when no official eye was watching, living, simply, defiantly living, beneath the weight of everything. Chapter 8. Transition to the modern era. Independence, when it finally came, did not arrive as a clean beginning. It rarely does. The Spanish administration had departed. The viceroys were gone. The flags had changed, and the proclamations had been made, and the battles had been fought and won. But the world the Spanish had built over 3 centuries, the haciendas, the racial hierarchies, the church, the cities, the deeply entrenched patterns of who owned what and who owed what to whom, none of that had changed. Independence was a political event. The social order it inherited was ancient, stubborn, and largely intact. And so, the new Republic of Peru found itself, in the 1820s and 30s, facing a task of extraordinary difficulty, trying to construct a functioning modern state on a foundation that had been designed for something else entirely. It did not go smoothly. The decades that followed independence were turbulent in the way that only young republics in difficult circumstances can be turbulent. Coups, counter-coups, a parade of constitutions, each one promising order, and each one eventually giving way to the next crisis. Caudillos, strongmen, military leaders, regional power brokers, rose and fell with unsettling frequency, each one claiming to be a solution, each one eventually becoming part of the problem. The institutional structures of republican government existed on paper, but the habits and relationships that make institutions real, trust, shared norms, the patient acceptance of electoral outcomes, took much longer to develop. And then, from the sea, came something unexpected. Guano. It sounds almost comic as the turning point in a nation's fortunes. But the vast deposits of seabird droppings that had accumulated over millennia on Peru's Pacific coastal islands turned out to be extraordinarily valuable, among the most potent natural fertilizers in the world, desperately sought by the rapidly industrializing agricultural economies of Europe and North America. In the middle decades of the 19th century, Peru sat on top of what amounted to a geological lottery ticket. And for a brief, remarkable period, the country cashed it in. The guano era transformed Peru's finances almost overnight. Revenue poured into Lima. The country briefly became one of the wealthier states in Latin America, building railways into the highlands, modernizing ports, funding public works on a scale previously unimaginable. The Pacific coast hummed with activity. Lima expanded and beautified itself. The future, for a moment, seemed to be arriving ahead of schedule. President Ramón Castilla, who governed in the 1840s through the 1860s, used some of that guano wealth for something more consequential than infrastructure. He abolished black slavery in Peru. He ended the head tax that had been levied on indigenous people since colonial times, a tax that had functioned as a constant grinding reminder of their subordinate status in the republic that had supposedly liberated them. He expanded public education. These were not complete solutions to Peru's profound social inequalities, but they were real steps, acknowledgements, at least, that the republic had obligations to all of its people, not only the comfortable ones. To replace the coerced labor that these reforms had dismantled, Peru turned to a new source. Tens of thousands of Chinese workers, recruited under indenture contracts that offered freedom in theory while delivering something closer to bondage in practice, arrived on the coastal plantations and railway construction sites. They came from Guangdong province, mostly. They came expecting something better than what they found. And yet, they stayed, and their descendants stayed, and over generations they wove themselves into the fabric of Peruvian society in ways that would prove permanent and deeply significant. Peru's demographic story was becoming more complex, more layered, more genuinely multiple with every passing decade. But the guano boom did not last. It never does. The deposits were finite, foreign competitors found alternatives. The revenues slowed and then stopped. And Peru, which had borrowed heavily against its expected future earnings, found itself dangerously exposed. What followed was catastrophe. The War of the Pacific, fought between Peru and Bolivia on one side and Chile on the other, from 1879 to 1883, was the defining trauma of modern Peruvian history. Chilean forces occupied Lima. The national archives were looted. The railways and industries so painfully built during the guano era were destroyed or carried off. Peru lost the southern province of Tarapacá permanently, and the provinces of Tacna and Arica for decades. The national treasury was empty. The national confidence was shattered. And yet, from the wreckage, something began to be rebuilt. The aftermath of the War of the Pacific forced Peru into a painful reckoning with its own finances and its own economy. Debts were renegotiated. New export sectors were developed. Rubber, then cotton, then sugar, then minerals from the increasingly accessible highlands. A new coastal elite emerged, tied to export agriculture and mining, connected to British and later American capital, organized politically through the Civilista Party, the party of civilization, they called it, meaning, in practice, the party of those who already had everything and wished to keep it. This oligarchic order dominated Peruvian politics into the 20th century. But the 20th century had ideas of its own. President Augusto Leguía, who ruled for 11 years from 1992 to 1930, in a period known as the Oncenio, borrowed heavily from American banks to fund an ambitious program of road building, urban improvement, and state expansion. Lima was modernized. Roads pushed into the highlands for the first time, connecting communities that had lived in relative isolation for centuries. The state grew larger and more present in everyday life. But beneath the modernizing surface, the politics were increasingly authoritarian, the foreign debt increasingly dangerous, and when the global depression arrived in 1930, it swept Leguía away almost immediately. Around him, and around the oligarchy he represented, new voices were rising. The early 20th century was a time of extraordinary intellectual and political ferment in Peru. The APRA movement, the American Popular Revolutionary Alliance, founded by Victor Vau Aya de la Torre, brought indigenous rights, workers' demands, and anti-imperialist politics into the national conversation with a force that the old elites found deeply threatening. Marxist and socialist currents ran alongside it. The indigenista movement, writers, artists, intellectuals insisting on the value and dignity of indigenous Andean culture, was reshaping how Peru understood itself. These movements were suppressed, periodically, with considerable violence. But they could not be unmade. The questions they raised were too real, too urgent, too deeply rooted in the actual experience of too many Peruvians. And the people themselves were moving. Through the middle decades of the 20th century, and accelerating in the latter half, a great migration was underway. Highlands to coast, Ural to urban, Quechua-speaking communities from the Andes streaming down into Lima and other coastal cities, building homes on the desert hillsides surrounding the capital, creating the sprawling barriados, the shanty towns. The pueblos yongues that would come to house millions of people and reshape the physical and cultural face of Peru entirely. Lima swelled. It transformed. It became, over the course of a few decades, a genuinely mestizo city, neither purely European nor purely Andean, but something new, something in the making, loud and creative and full of energy, and also full of poverty and inequality and the unresolved tensions of centuries. Peru in the 20th century oscillated between civilian governments and military coups with exhausting regularity. Some military governments were conservative, protecting oligarchic interests. Others were reformist, most notably the government of General Juan Velasco Alvarado in the late 1960s and early 70s, which nationalized industries, broke up the great haciendas, and launched a sweeping land reform that finally, after a century and a half of independence, began to dismantle the quasi-feudal structures of the countryside. Then came the crisis years. The 1980s brought hyperinflation that destroyed savings and crushed the middle class. It brought the Shining Path, the Sendero Luminoso, a Maoist insurgency that tore through the highland communities of Peru with extraordinary brutality, killing tens of thousands of civilians in a conflict that lasted into the 90s. It brought fear and displacement and the further acceleration of migration to the cities. And from that devastation, another turn. Neoliberal reforms in the 90s, privatizations, structural adjustments, the opening of the economy to foreign investment in mining, oil, and gas. A reorientation toward global markets that brought macroeconomic stability and, for some years, impressive growth rates, while leaving many of the underlying inequalities intact and adding new tensions between development and the rights of indigenous communities over their ancestral lands. Modern Peru, by the turn of the 21st century, was a country of remarkable complexity and remarkable contradiction, ancient and new, urban and rural, growing and unequal, globally connected and locally divided. A society still working through questions that had been accumulating unanswered for 500 years. The transition to the modern era, still, in so many ways, underway, still unfinished, still alive. Chapter 9. Things Peru is known for today. There are some places in the world that arrive in the imagination before you ever visit them. Places whose images have traveled so far and embedded themselves so deeply in the collective human mind that the name alone conjures something vivid and immediate. A shape, a color, a feeling. Peru is one of those places. And as we move now into the chapters of the living, breathing present, into what this extraordinary country has given the world, and what the world has come to cherish about it, let us move slowly, savoring each thing, the way you might turn objects over in your hands, feeling their weight. Begin, as most people do when they think of Peru, with a mountain. High in the Andes, at an altitude of nearly 2,400 meters above sea level, on a narrow ridge between two sharp peaks, sits a city that was abandoned and forgotten by the outside world for nearly 400 years. Machu Picchu, the citadel the Inca built, For reasons still not entirely understood, in the mid-15th century, terraces descending in great steps down mountainside, stone walls fitted together with a precision that needs no mortar and has survived centuries of earthquakes, temples and palaces and agricultural plots and water channels, all arranged with an architectural intelligence that still leaves visitors quietly speechless. When the American historian Hiram Bingham arrived here in 1911, led by a local boy who knew perfectly well where it was, he described it as the lost city of the Incas. The phrase stuck, the image traveled, and today, Machu Picchu is one of the most recognized human-made structures on the planet, one of the new 7 wonders of the world, a place that draws visitors from every country on Earth, all of them climbing through the morning clouds to stand on those ancient stones and feel, however briefly, the particular vertigo of deep time. But Machu Picchu, magnificent as it is only one thread in a very long tapestry. Come down from the mountains now. Come south and west to the coast, to the pale sun-bleached plateau of the Nazca Desert, where something waits on the ground that can only be properly seen from the sky. The Nazca Lines. Etched into the desert surface by the Nazca people between roughly 2,000 and 1,500 years ago, vast geoglyphs depicting hummingbirds and condors, monkeys and spiders, perfectly proportioned geometric spirals stretching for kilometers across the pale earth. The precision is extraordinary. The scale is almost incomprehensible at ground level. From the air, the figures resolve into something unmistakable. A hummingbird with wings outstretched, a spider with every leg articulated, a condor soaring across the desert in permanent silence. Why were they made? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. Sacred pathways, perhaps, astronomical calendars, offerings to sky deities, visible only to beings or gods who could look down from above. The Nazca Lines carry their mystery lightly, unbothered by the centuries of speculation. They are simply there, patient and enormous, and quietly astonishing. From the desert, travel north and east into the highlands, to Cusco, the navel of the world, the Inca called it, and the sacred valley spreading out below it. Cusco is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the Americas. Its streets are lined with walls of Inca stonework so perfect, so beautifully fitted, that the Spanish colonial buildings constructed on top of them have crumbled and shifted, while the Inca foundations remain immovable. To walk in Cusco is to walk in layers. Inca stone below, colonial plaster above, and the living, breathing present all around you. Quechua, spoken in the markets. Women in traditional dress carrying bundles through narrow streets. The smell of food and flowers and altitude. And spreading outward from Cusco, the sacred valley, that lush, green, river-threaded corridor where Inca terraces still cling to the mountainsides, where Andean communities maintain traditions of weaving and farming and ceremony that stretch back centuries without interruption. Peru's ancient world does not only belong to the Inca. The country's pre-Columbian heritage is extraordinary in its depth and variety. Chan Chan, on the northern coast, the great adobe city of the Chimu, the largest pre-Columbian city in South America, its walls decorated of intricate friezes of fish and waves and geometric patterns. Haka Poklana in Lima, rising incongruously from the middle of the modern city, a great adobe pyramid from the Lima culture, 1,500 years old. Visible from the surrounding apartment buildings, like a dream surfacing from beneath everyday life. The Moshi, the Nazca, the Chimu. each one a world, each one still present, still legible, still offering itself to anyone who wishes to look. Now come to Lima itself, the sprawling, chaotic, beautiful, complicated capital. Its historic center, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, preserves the grand plazas and ornate colonial architecture of the Spanish imperial era. The Cathedral of Lima, the Archbishop's Palace with its elaborately carved wooden balconies, the grand main plaza, where on the same ground where the Spanish dismantled and rebuilt a world, life simply continues. Pigeons, street vendors, school groups, the ordinary miracle of a living city over an ancient one. But Lima today is known for something else as well. Something that surprises people who think of Peru primarily in terms of archaeology and landscape. Food. Lima has become, over the past 2 decades, one of the great gastronomic capitals of the world. Not by accident. Peru's cuisine is the product of the same extraordinary layering that characterizes everything else about this country. Indigenous Indian ingredients and techniques, meeting Chinese and Japanese and African and Spanish influences, blending and transforming across centuries into something that is entirely its own. Ceviche, fresh fish cured in citrus, scattered with Chilean onion, clean and bright and achingly good. The rich, complex stews of the highlands, the sophisticated fusion cooking of Lima's world-class restaurants, which have placed the city on lists of the world's best dining destinations for years running. To eat in Peru is to taste the country's history, every dish a kind of archaeology. Then there is the living culture, the textiles woven by Quechua and Aymara communities in patterns and techniques that have been passed down for generations. Each color, each motif carrying meaning. The music that fills the highland festivals, the coastal celebrations, the urban neighborhoods of Lima. The festivals themselves, explosions of color and devotion and community that blend Catholic saints' days with Andean ceremony in ways that feel, by now, entirely natural. High above all of it, literally, Lake Titicaca, sitting at nearly 3,800 meters above sea level on the border between Peru and Bolivia. It is the highest navigable lake in the world. Its blue surface reflects a sky so close it feels touchable. On its waters, the Oros people maintain floating islands made of totora reeds, as they have for centuries. And in Andean mythology, Titicaca is where the world began, where the sun and moon rose from the water at the moment of creation. There is something about standing on its shore that makes mythology feel entirely reasonable. And finally, the land itself. Colca Canyon, one of the deepest canyons in the world, where Andean condors, those vast improbable birds with their 3-meter wingspans, catch the morning thermals and rise without effort into the pale Andean sky. The cloud forests of the eastern Andes, where the mountains drop toward the jungle and the air turns warm and thick and alive. The Amazon lowlands, stretching eastward in their unimaginable vastness, holding more species of plant and animal than almost anywhere else on Earth. Peru is a biodiversity hotspot of global significance. Its range of environments, from cold Pacific coast to high-altitude grassland to tropical rainforest, creates a richness of life that scientists are still, in the truest sense, discovering. New species found here every year. Ecosystems of complexity and importance that extend far beyond Peru's borders, serving the health of the entire planet. All of this is what Peru has given the world: ancient stones and desert drawings, sacred lakes and living traditions, food that tells stories, landscapes that take the breath away, a culture so layered, so various, so stubbornly alive, across so many thousands of years of change and pressure and transformation, that it stands today as one of the most remarkable human stories on Earth. Worth knowing, worth visiting, worth on a quiet evening, in a comfortable place somewhere far away. Worth simply sitting with and marveling at. Chapter 10. Peru today. And so we arrive at the present. Not the end of the story. There was no end. Not yet. Not for a country still so very much alive and in motion. But the present moment. The world as it stands right now, in these first years of the 21st century's third decade, in a republic that has been formally independent for just over 200 years, and informally, stubbornly, magnificently itself for considerably longer than that. Peru today is an independent republic on the western coast of South America. Its capital is Lima, that fast, sprawling, complicated city on the Pacific, which has grown from a colonial administrative center into a metropolis of nearly 12 million people, one of the largest cities on the continent. In February, the fact is too late, and it's all being continued to find it. The country's population as a whole sits at around 34 to 35 million people, and roughly 4 out of every 5 Peruvians now live in urban areas. The Great Migration from the highlands to the coast, which began accelerating in the middle of the last century, has fundamentally and permanently reshaped where and how Peruvians live. The government is a unitary republic, a single-chamber Congress of the Republic sitting in Lima, and a president serving as both head of state and head of government. On paper, a functioning multi-party democracy. In practice, something considerably more complicated and considerably more turbulent. Peruvian politics in the present era is defined, above almost everything else, by fragmentation. Dozens of registered political parties compete for power, many of them vehicles for individual ambitions rather than coherent ideological projects. Presidents have been impeached, have resigned, have fled the country. Corruption scandals have touched nearly every major institution. Trust in government, in Congress, in the judiciary, in political parties, sits at some of the lowest levels in the region. Elections are coming in 2026, and the uncertainty around them reflects a broader uncertainty about the direction and stability of Peruvian democratic institutions. It is worth sitting with that honestly. Peru's political present is difficult. The people of this country, who have survived conquest and colonial extraction and war and insurgency and economic collapse, deserve better governance than they have consistently received. His class of common day is a backlog, and many of them know it and say so, loudly and persistently. The frustration is real, and so, in its way, is the resilience. The economy tells a similarly complicated story. Peru is classified as an upper-middle income country, with a gross domestic product of around $289 billion and a per capita income of roughly $8,400. Those numbers represent real growth, real improvement over the grinding poverty of the crisis decades. The economy has been anchored for much of this century by a mining sector of global significance. Copper, gold, silver. Peru is among the world's leading producers of all three, and the revenues from that extraction have funded public services, infrastructure, and economic stability in ways that matter to real people's lives. But mining is also a source of deep and ongoing tension. The communities living closest to the mines, often indigenous communities in the highlands and the jungle, frequently bear the environmental costs while receiving comparatively little of the economic benefit. Conflicts between mining companies, the state, and local communities have been a recurring feature of Peruvian political life. The debate between development and conservation, between national economic interest and local rights, between the present need and the future cost, runs through Peruvian public life like a fault line, quiet sometimes, but never entirely still. Agriculture and fisheries remain important. Tourism is growing. Peru has worked in recent years to promote its extraordinary range of destinations and experiences beyond the already famous circuit of Cusco and Machu Picchu, developing trekking routes, nature tourism in the Amazon, cultural travel in the highland communities. The country has genuine assets here that have barely been introduced to the world. And services, telecommunications, finance, retail have expanded rapidly with urbanization, creating a middle class that is larger and more economically active than at any previous point in Peruvian history. Life expectancy today sits at around 77 to 78 years, high for the region and a real indicator of the progress made in healthcare, nutrition, and basic services over the past several decades. But that number is an average, and averages can conceal as much as they reveal. The gap between urban and rural Peru, between the coastal middle class and the highland or Amazonian communities, remains significant. A child born in Lima and a child born in a remote Andean village enter, in many important ways, different versions of the same country. Spanish is spoken everywhere as the national language, the linguistic inheritance of the colonial centuries, but Peru also officially recognizes Quechua and Aymara in the regions where they are spoken, and millions of Peruvians move daily between Spanish and their indigenous language, carrying both worlds inside them, the way their ancestors always have. The linguistic diversity of Peru is not merely a demographic statistic. It is a living expression of the country's depth, the evidence that the Andean world, for all it has endured, has not been silenced. And the land itself endures. The Amazon rainforest, the Andean peaks, the desert coast, the high plateau, Peru remains one of the most biologically diverse nations on Earth. Its ecosystems hold species found nowhere else. Its rivers carry water that sustains communities and regulates climates across a continental scale. The conversation about how to protect that inheritance while meeting the legitimate development needs of a growing population is one of the most important conversations happening in Peru today. It has no easy answers, but it is being had by scientists and activists and community leaders and ordinary citizens who understand, in a way that comes from living close to the land, what is at stake. This, then, is Peru in the present moment. A country of 34 million people carrying 5,000 years of history in their hands. A republic struggling, honestly, and sometimes painfully, toward the ideals it proclaimed 2 centuries ago. An economy of genuine strengths and genuine inequalities. A culture of extraordinary richness, food and music and textile and ceremony and language, still alive, still evolving, still adding new layers to everything that came before. A place where a woman in a Lima restaurant serves ceviche that contains, in its ingredients and its technique, the meeting of continents. Where a weaver in a highland village uses patterns her grandmother taught her and her grandmother's grandmother taught her. Where a child in a pueblo joven on the hillsides above Lima speaks Spanish with her teachers and Quechua with her grandmother and moves between those worlds as easily as breathing. Where the stones of Machu Picchu sit in their mountain clouds, patient and indifferent to the centuries, while below them the country they once belonged to continues, arguing, building, struggling, celebrating, surviving. Surviving, as it always has. As, one feels certain, it always will. Calm closing. We have traveled a long way together. Not in miles, though the distance, if you measured it, would be extraordinary. From the cold Pacific shore to the high, thin air of the Andes, from the vast green silence of the Amazon to the pale desert valleys where the first farmers coaxed the first plants from the earth. We have moved through landscapes that would take a lifetime to fully know, and we have only glimpsed them, only pressed our faces briefly to the glass. But what a glimpse it has been. We began with the land itself, ancient and indifferent and breathtaking. The great spine of the Andes running north to south like a backbone, the jungle spreading eastward in its incomprehensible vastness, the desert coast lying pale and quiet against the Pacific, a stage set by forces so old that human history, in comparison, is barely a breath. And yet, unto that stage, humanity arrived. 15,000 years ago, at least, perhaps longer. Footprints in the sand at the edge of a cold sea, fires lit in highland caves above the clouds, the first careful hands pressing the first seeds into the first Peruvian soil. We watched those first people slowly, patiently, learn the land. The coastal fisherfolk weaving cotton in the evening light, the highland cave dwellers at Laracocha living at altitudes that would exhaust most of us, generation after generation, finding ways to thrive. The early farmers in the Zanya Valley laying stones in channels to guide water where it was needed. Small, quiet acts of intelligence and adaptation, accumulating across centuries into something larger than any single person could have imagined. And then, Corral, those great mounds rising from the desert valley floor, one of the first cities in the Americas, built by people who had no pottery, no metal, no writing, and yet somehow produced architecture of coordinated ambition and spiritual authority that still stands today, 5,000 years later, in the pale Peruvian sun. We moved through the centuries slowly, the way this kind of history deserves to be moved through. Chavin and its spreading religious vision, a shared sacred language knitting distant Andean communities together across mountain passes and river valleys. The Moshe on the northern coast with their extraordinary pottery, their warrior elites, their painted temples. The Nazca in the south, drawing their enormous mysterious figures into the desert floor. A hummingbird, a condor, a spider, as if leaving messages for the sky. The Chimu and their great Abobi city of Chan Chan. The Wari building roads across the highlands, learning what an empire might feel like, laying the groundwork for what was coming. And then the Inca, that remarkable transformation of one regional highland power into the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, absorbing and refining and vastly expanding everything that had come before. The roads, the terraces, the storage systems, the sacred city of Cusco at the center of a world that stretched from modern Colombia to modern Chile. An achievement so extraordinary that it still does not feel entirely real, standing in the ruins of it. And then, the afternoon at Cajamarca, the world dividing into before and after. 3 centuries of colonial rule that remade almost everything: the settlements, the labor, the religion, the language, the very shape of daily life. While something essential, something deep and stubborn and alive, quietly persisted beneath the surface, in the offerings poured into the earth when no official eye was watching, in the Quechua spoke at home while Spanish was performed for the authorities, in the textiles woven in patterns that carried meanings the colonizers never fully understood and never fully extinguished. Independence, and the long, difficult, unfinished work of becoming a republic, in fact as well as in name. The guano boom and its revenues, the devastation of the War of the Pacific, the oligarchs and the caudillos and the reformers and the revolutionaries. The Great Migration from the highlands to Lima. Millions of people carrying their languages and their foods and their music down from the mountains and into the coastal city, making it into something new. Something genuinely Peruvian in ways that the colonial capital never quite was. And Peru today, complicated and alive. 34 million people navigating the tensions between growth and inequality, between extraction and conservation, between the demands of the present and the inheritance of the past. A cuisine that has taken the world by surprise. A biodiversity that humbles the imagination. A culture so layered, so many civilizations deep, that you could spend a lifetime studying it and still find something new on the next page. What strikes you, sitting with all of it now, is not any single fact or date or monument. It is something harder to name. A quality of endurance, perhaps. A sense that the people of Peru have been asked again and again, across 5,000 years, to absorb enormous change, to survive enormous loss, and to continue. And they have continued. Not unchanged. Change is the only constant in any human story, but continuous, unbroken, carrying something forward through every disruption, every conquest, every crisis, every transformation. The stones of Machu Picchu did not build themselves. They were carried up a mountain, one at a time, by human hands, placed with extraordinary care by people who believed that what they were making mattered, that it was worth the effort, worth the altitude, worth the years. That belief that what we build together matters, that the effort is worth it, that something can be made to last, runs through the entire Peruvian story like a quiet, persistent thread. And now the story rests, not ends, rests. Lima is still breathing out there in the dark, beneath the southern hemisphere stars. The Andes are still standing, patient and cold and enormous. The Amazon is still dreaming its vast green dream, full of creatures that have never seen a human face. And somewhere on the Pacific coast, the same cold ocean that those first fisherfolk stood beside 15,000 years ago is still moving against the same pale shore, indifferent and eternal and quietly beautiful. You have traveled a long way tonight. And now, it is time to be still. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of your body settle. Let the mountains and the desert and the jungle and the sea all recede gently into the background of your mind, like the last light fading from a very beautiful day. Peru will be there. When you wake up, it has been there for a very long time, and it is not going anywhere. Rest now. Rest